John F. Kennedy was the President of the United States during the Cuban Missile Crisis. One of the events that took place during this crisis was the Bay of Pigs invasion. It turned out to be a failure because of the lack of air support. JFK did not send help. He also placed missiles in Turkey. The Peace Corps was a success because it involved the younger generation. JFK also built up the military by increasing the budget by 30%. He also started an embargo with Cuba. This meant that there was no trade or diplomatic relations. This crippled the Cuban economy. We thought that they were working with the USSR. JFK did not like the missiles because he thought that they made him seem weak. He feared for protection, and because of the missile gap. Castro was the leader of Cuba during this time. He feared an attempt on his life, and he also hated JFK. He liked the missiles because they could blow JFK away. They were a bargaining chip, and he wanted them for protection. Khrushchev was the leader of Russia during this time. He was not concerned about Cuba. He wanted the U.S. to get the missiles out of Turkey. He used them as a bargaining chip. He also wanted peaceful coexistence.
On October 14, 1962, U-2 spy missions from the United States flew over Cuba, taking pictures and discovering sites to launch nuclear missiles. This led to talks about the situation, and the following day, and on October 16th, a committee was set up to address the problem. The Executive Committee, EXCOM, considered the options of blockading, invading, or bombing. EXCOM met without the president, and while Robert Kennedy favored the idea of a blockade, the military wanted bombing. Ultimately, the decision was made to start a blockade. Several days later, Russian ships were on their way to Cuba, and if they didn't stop, it would lead to war. If this would happen, it wouldn't look good for Khrushchev, as he would appear to be the aggressor. There was a worldwide tension as everyone waited to see if war would break out. The Russian ships proceeded to stop at the embargo line on October 24th. On the 26th, Khrushchev sent a message through diplomatic relations. The message said that the USSR would take their missiles out of Cuba if the United States agreed to never invade Cuba. However, a new message was sent soon after, stating the same agreements as the first message, but adding that the United States must take their missiles out of Turkey. The United States had difficulty in coming to a decision because they were unsure of who they were dealing with in these messages. In the end, on October 28th, the United States agreed to the terms of the first message, and disaster was successfully avoided. However, many communists in Russia were upset with Khrushchev, thinking he was too lenient and wanted him replaced. Later on, after U.S. presidential elections, a secret deal was made and the United States missiles in Turkey were removed.
The effects of the Cuban Missile Crisis. In the short term, U.S. President Kennedy's prestige increased enormously. He was promoted as the one who had called Khrushchev's bluff. Khrushchev's retreat met with bitter criticism from Mao and Castro, accusing him of surrendering to the U.S. It also weakened his position within the USSR. In Cuba, the Soviet decision to remove the missiles was seen as a betrayal by Castro and convinced him that Cuba would have to develop its own independent revolutionary strategy. By the mid-1960s, Castro actively assisted revolutionary movements in the Third World, not only to support the spread of communism, but also to distract the U.S. so that it would not renew pressure on Cuba. In the USSR, the overwhelming superiority of the U.S. in nuclear weapons, as shown during the nuclear crisis, came as a shock to the Soviet leadership. Thus, the USSR began an ambitious program for the construction of ICBMs. The total command of the seas by the U.S. also persuaded the USSR to build a large navy, which in the future would enable it to project its power globally. The Cuban Missile Crisis also resulted in a reduction in international tension. The Cuban Missile Crisis brought both the U.S. and the USSR to the brink of nuclear war. However, it did lead to an understanding by both sides that nuclear war would lead to what became known as mutually assured destruction. Thus, both sides began to give priority to plans for controlling the proliferation of nuclear weapons and their testing. In 1963, a hotline was established which linked both the U.S. and the Soviets.